So today I'm going to talk about Iran of the Pahlavi era, the Shah's government, and the Arab-Israeli conflict, a topic that has been often spoken about, but I hope to show that with the new archival holdings at the Zahiri archives at Hoover here, we can sort of open new vistas to them. It is well known that Iran of the Shah had rather close ties with Israel. Under the Shah's government, there were security ties, there were energy ties, there were commercial ties. Many Iranians visited Israel. There are generations of Iranian babies who used to be called Israeli babies because the Iranian mothers would go to get fertility treatment in Israel. There were Iranian singers who would sing in Israel. There were Israeli singers who would sing in Iran. There were rather extensive ties, while unlike what many think, the two governments didn't actually have official ties, open ties, i.e. there were not official diplomatic relations between the two countries. The question is, what explains these close ties between Iran and Israel at the era? And what was really the nature of them? If they were so close, how come they weren't open? These are some of the questions I hope to talk about today, based on my research and based on my findings. Now, there are usually a few explanations given to explain the reality of these ties. One of the most popular ones is the sort of periphery policy, or the periphery policy. It is well known that the government of David Ben-Gurion, the first prime minister of Israel, had a policy that since Israel obviously could not be friends with its neighbors, it should be friends with the neighbors of its neighbors. I.e., since it was in conflict with the Arab countries surrounding it, it should build links with the non-Arab countries of the Middle East, the fellow non-Arab countries of the Middle East, that is Iran, Turkey, and Ethiopia. There were many reasons for these links, and they existed at the time. Then there's the Cold War explanation. Naturally, since Iran and Israel both found themselves on the side of the US in the early 50s, the first years of the founding of Israel, and the first years of Mohammad Reza Shah's really return to power following the 1953 coup in Iran, naturally they would be on the same side. And there's, of course, this sort of the official Islamic Republic narrative, if you will, which actually it's kind of also very close to what was the official, I would say, perhaps the new left explanation at the time. The opponents of the Shah's regime had a very basic answer. Of course, Shah has good relations to Israel. It's subservient to the US. It does what the US tells it. That's why it has good relations to Israel. If you notice, what all these explanations have in common is that none of them actually explains the motivations of the Shah regime itself. And of the country, of a country like Iran, which had a diplomatic apparatus, which had its own independent policy making. Periphery policy explains it as a policy of Israel. The other explanations also explain it as policy of the US. But why the Shah regime, why the Shah itself and the Iranian state decided for this? There's also a lot of discussions when it comes to Iranian foreign policy of that era of the role of individuals. Since we often don't have access to diplomatic archives, we have access to memoirs. So there's a lot of discussions actually about the role of Arash Zahedi, who was seen as negative at the time, was seen as negative by some in Israel and by some, like Meir Ezri, a sort of very well-known Iranian sort of Zionist activist who was, who lived in Iran and often acted on behalf of Israel in different ways, or as an in-between. And this is again explained in many memoirs as to the role of Arash Zahedi when he was foreign minister and was leading Iranian diplomat. There is even a mention of Arash Zahedi's sort of possibly negative role when he leaves the foreign ministry in 1971. He's no longer foreign minister. Davar, which is a major newspaper in Israel, explains, sort of celebrates that almost, or talks about it as a fact of, this was good news for Israel relations. But what I'm hoping to talk about today, and the approach that I'm hoping to suggest, is that if we want to understand Iranian foreign policy, if we want to understand how it is made, what were its motivations, what were its sort of contradictions, we are well served to look at the Iranian archives, just like we do with any other country. In fact, it's striking that because of the sort of lack of archival resources sometimes, we can read pages after pages about sort of foreign policy of Iran at the time, based on a variety of guesses, of insinuations, but not, not the actual archival records. So, and even memoirs basically have that quality. I mean, what does it really mean that a person was known to have this view or that view based on memoirs that were written 50 years later? There's no other country, again, if you pick up a book about US foreign policy, you rarely are going to have as main explanator. I mean, the job of historians is usually to look at basically archival record at a time, not recollections of later years of memoirs. Of course, they can be important and they can be added on, but not as the main. Now, but of course, this would be easy to say when we don't have the resources. It would be a very classic historian thing to say, oh, well, it would be great if you have these archives, but we don't really have them. So what does it really mean? Well, I'll go to this and then back. Well, now we do. As I have discovered, to my delight, in the last 2 months, the Zahedi papers at Hoover present a truly golden opportunity to go and look at different levels of decision making, to go and look at how policy was made in Iran, inside the foreign ministry, and to go and see what were the different contradictions while the policy was being made. These archives are not complete, of course. They're not a replacement of the full diplomatic archives you find in other parts of the world. Professor Milani has written and explained in his work how Arash Zahedi himself apparently actually had a key role in bringing sort of professional note-taking to foreign policy meetings. But of course, Arash Zahedi was foreign minister, in a relatively sort of short period. And then he was an ambassador to the United States also in 2 periods. But there's before and after. It can be frustrating when you're following something to see that there's a gap. It is also not clear entirely, what were the documents he was able to get out. I'm sure it was not sort of in ideal conditions necessarily. But nevertheless, what is very clear in the last 2 months of me going every day to Hoover and spending a few hours there, that there's a wealth of information, wealth of Iranian foreign policy documents that certainly are enough for, I think, my lifetime of work and a few others. So basically, students want to work on this, and the scholars, I think, no longer have an excuse that we don't have. These archives are particularly rich because they include a variety of sources. They include published, internally published, sorry. I don't know why my phone gets provoked by the word publish, but be it internally, like internal really top secret documents, but they also include a variety of levels. There is this sort of form of document called Sharaf Yabi, which is basically a document of for the view of the Shah, a summary of things that happened that Shah has to see. There are different versions of these documents, right? There's the final version, there's the edited version, there's a version coming from the other side, how they have been mixed. There are press clippings. Apparently, the very interesting service existed at the time. I was shocked to learn this, where there were agencies where you could hire and see, whenever my name comes in the press, because there was a very vibrant press in Iran in certain periods, 41 to 53, just bring it to me. And some of this exists in the Fazlullah Zahedi's part. And of course, relevant to my topic, Fazlullah Zahedi was interned in Palestine, actually, when Palestine was a site of British internment camps, and Fazlullah Zahedi was there. So there's his recollections. So a very rich source exists here. I want to go back to, this is sort of one of the titles of my dissertation, running titles of my dissertation, called But From Below. When Roma was reading it, you might have noticed that, it doesn't seem to be directly, what my dissertation doesn't seem to be directly related to talk. I think what is related is the approach of what I call Cold War from below. Studies of the Cold War have often looked at superpowers in Moscow and Washington to explain this. In fact, if you read some of the central important narratives of the Cold War, let's say John Lewis Gaddis's Cold War, the only actors that really appear are not even sort of members of parliament. They're usually leading government figures on both sides. but both sides being the Soviet Union and the United States. I think research here shows that I mean Cold War from below in two sense. I mean that on a societal level, people were involved in the Cold War. They cared about this global struggle that was going on. And on the country level, they also cared about it. The Shah of Iran was not a passive subject of the Cold War. He was not a victim of superpower power games between each other. And he was not also, in another tradition that exists in the Cold War, he was not someone who was, this is often said about the President Nasser of Egypt and others, not someone who was just trying to smartly play the superpowers against each other like mommy and daddy and sort of had no interest of his own. I hope to show that that's not the case. I hope to show that the Shah of Iran of the Pahlavi era, had in fact a conscious, consistent foreign policy that was not like all other policies, he wasn't always followed, but that if you look at it throughout a long period, you can see elements of it, and elements that are frankly surprising or certainly go against some of the dominant assumptions we have. Now, I want to also emphasize that, like a good historian, I have really been guided by the archives. I have been guided by the empirical evidence. In fact, for some other work that I had on Iran and Vietnam, I really started out showing how Shah followed US's policy in Vietnam. I thought that was the paper. It turned out that my paper about a different topic turned out to be about perhaps the opposite, i.e. how Shah did not follow US policies in Vietnam. So I think it's good. We remember that. Now, let me start with what is called siyasat mustaqil milli, national independent policy. Throughout this period, Shah kept claiming that Iran follows what he called national independent policy. In Persian, we don't have a system of capitalizing words, but this basically appears like a capitalized, like a central phrase that is always used. I.e., it's not just that he said we have a policy. It was not just that he was trying to use nice words like national independence. This was a consistent phrase used by Iran. And in fact, if you see this newspaper title on the top, it says, "Why is West working against Iran? The national independent policy." I.e., not only the Shah was meant to say that he follows a policy as national independent, he also saw that in contradiction, not just with the Soviet Union, but with the West. And it sort of counters our dominant image of a West following Shah that we have. Now, what did national independent policy mean when it comes to the central conflict of the era in our region of the Middle East, i.e. the Arab-Israeli conflict? And I use Arab-Israeli conflict, I think I used Palestinian-Israeli conflict in the previous iteration. To be clear, I use the term Arab-Israeli conflict to talk about the broader, not just Israel's clash with the Palestinians, but Israel's war with the Arab countries, Egypt and Syria chiefly, and the series of war in 1948, 1956, 1967, 1973 that he had. So we want to see what was his national independent policy in relation to Israel-Palestine, and was it really, was it how national and how independent was it? Perhaps we can talk about, but also what were its elements and what did it actually mean, and what evidence do we have in the historical record to say this? I think it would be necessary to give a very brief overview of how I don't have it in the slides, but I think I can do it on the fly, as I say, up to what were the relations, how did things stand between Iran and Israel, Palestine? Iran, so, I assume you know the basics, obviously, following the First World War, Palestine, which used to be part of the Ottoman Empire, comes under the control of Britain. The British Mandate of Palestine is formed. In 1917, the Balfour Declaration promises a Jewish national home. There's sort of Jewish settlement in Palestine. Iran, as one of the major states of the era, had the consular presence in Jerusalem already. There was an Iranian consular presence in Jerusalem, and following the First World War is also when we have the formation of the League of Nations, of which Iran is it's the only Muslim country that is actually the. Are we good? Sorry, anything I should do? Iran was the only Muslim country that was a founding member of the League of Nations. Turkey and Iraq joined in later years. But the point is, Iran had a statehood. This is very important. Iran, unlike many other countries, unlike all Arab countries effectively, has a statehood history that goes, a statehood and sovereignty history that goes back quite a while. Now, in the early years, so long as you can say Iran has a policy, this is the sort of Pahlavi era, first the Reza Shah, the father, and the son who comes in 1941. But the general approach is actually pro-Arab, obviously, and the Arab opinion is opposition to Jewish settlement in Palestine, and Iran generally follows that. In 1935, Baghar Kazemi, Iran's envoy to the League of Nations, speaks, speaks sort of in favor of the Arabs of Palestine, so much that he actually gets a note of thank you from Hajj Amin Hosseini, the famous or infamous view Mufti of Jerusalem at the time. This is just 1 year before the Arab Revolt. When, after the Second World War, when Palestine is going to be divided, the United Nations obviously decides at some point to divide Palestine into an Arab and a Jewish state, right, in November of 1947. But prior to that, actually, Iran, again, shows you the long history of Iranian statehood. Iran is one of those states that gets a chance to send a representative and be part of the UN system that goes to sort of visit Israel, Palestine, prepare a report, plan what to do. Nasrallah Antazam, who later is the president of the UN General Assembly, is the Iranian diplomat who goes there. In recent years, we've had some, this is how memoirs can be fun. So the memoirs of people who was in the street. There was Latin Americans, and there were obviously sort of representatives of the Jewish agency of what's called the Yishuv. They've published some memoirs that shed some interesting light on Intizam and sort of his views there. I think a lot of people, he went there with a sort of pro-Muslim and pro-Arab orientation, generally speaking, but he was impressed by what the Jewish community had been able to achieve. But at any rate, the attitude of Iran is very clear in those years. Iran, together with India and Yugoslavia, presents an alternative plan. Right? It's against the division or the partition of Palestine, and it was called. It presents a federal plan that is rejected by the UN. The UN goes for the partition plan. And in the next few important votes, Iran votes against the membership of Israel in the United Nations. Now, these are very sensitive years. Be conscious of the time, even though I have a very generous time here. These are very sensitive years in the history of Iran, of course. In 1941, Reza Shah is overthrown. Mohammad Reza Shah comes to the throne. We have 12 years of relatively open conditions of the press. The Iranian parliament, has genuinely democratically elected members who are able to voice views on certain things. The issue of Palestine becomes very important. So, if I want to paint a very brief view of how this political scene is viewed at the time, the Tudeh Party of Iran, the Communist Tudeh Party of Iran, which was formed in 1941, is unique in having a lot of Jewish members. It's one of the first parties that allows Jews to join, and it has a very active sort of Jewish membership. As historians like Leo Stenfeld has shown, these Jewish Iranians come to play an important role in the party, but also not just because of the Jewish Iranians, but because the general line of the communist movement in the world, the communist movement led by the Soviet Union in 1947, changed its line on Zionism, had decades-long policy of opposition to Zionism. It adopts a new line that sort of generally recognizes the Jewish right to self-determination. So as a result, the Tudeh Party of Iran is the biggest proponent of ties with Israel. Not only it calls on the Iranian government to recognize Israel and establish relations with Israel, it celebrates Israeli independence. In the Iranian Tudeh Party meetings, to the youth meetings, Hava Nagila, which is something of a Hebrew hymn, careful to say, it's not really a Zionist song, I just to say, but it's definitely a song that comes out of the issue. It's sang in sort of communist meetings by Jews and non-Jews in Iran. And as I said, the Communist Party, if you look at the meetings, they're just like the Communist Party in the United States, actually, and the Communist Party of Great Britain, the Communist parties in many other countries, calls for open relations with Israel. At the same time, there is the Pan-Iranist Party, which is sort of anti-Semitic. It works against it works against Israel. Obviously, it speaks against it. Ayatollah Kashani claims that he's gonna gather some people to bring them to Palestine to fight in the 1948 war. To my knowledge, this didn't actually happen. Ayatollah Khamenei was not able to mobilize anyone and take it there to fight the 1948 war. But he definitely does claim that he's going to do it. The Mufti that we just talked about, who had tanked Iran in 1935, he's sort of active in the Iranian press. He gives an interview to the Kayhan against the Jews, as he says. He sort of speaks in a very anti-Semitic language against the international Jew, and he warns against Israel. So Israel is being discussed. Now, Mohammad Mossadegh, who is who is obviously a proponent of independence for Iranian oil sector, for nationalization of Iranian oil sector, he comes to the scene. The movement of Mossadegh is viewed positively by some in Israel, who see it as a fellow fighter against the British imperialism. Of course, Israel had come to be by fighting the British mandate, the British occupiers. So, in fact, you'd be surprised perhaps to know that Israeli right-wing, the revisionist party, this is the right of the Israeli political scene, which is very sort of anti-British, even more than the dominant trend in Israel, which is social democratic, but less anti-British. They celebrate Mossadegh. The revisionists celebrate Mossadegh. At any rate, Iran recognizes Israel de facto when parliament is in recess under the government of Mohammad Saeed Maraghi, interesting prime minister, born in Tbilisi. And when the Mossadegh government comes, it's one of the first acts that it does is actually takes back the recognition. There are some murky accounts here because they sort of say there's a financial reasons they take it back. But long story short, there's definitely some in the Mossadegh government, including Fatemi, the foreign minister, who seem to have had a negative view. See, I'm doing what I sort of criticized earlier because we don't have a lot of accounts from the era, so we have to sort of go by what we have. But Fatemi definitely gives the speech in the parliament against Israel. Lines of conflict are being developed in a different way. This is Nasser hasn't come to power in Egypt yet, right? That happens in 1952. But already Fatemi imagines a world of Iran allying itself with Arab opinion in a way that would be anti-Israel. It seems to be happening. Well, obviously, the 1953 US-backed coup in Iran puts an end to sort of an environment where that can be discussed freely, and a different line follows. In the same era, I should also mention that there are some in the Iranian politics, like say Haj Ali Razmara, well-known army figure, who are also pro-Israel because they see it as a, as a sort of very competent army. But the love relation between Iranian, let's say, left and Israel, of course, continues for decades after. Again, these are parts of the history that sort of sometimes are forgotten, but this exists a lot, of course. Jalal Ahmad goes to Israel, writes a very glowing travelogue that criticizes later, Dariush Ashuri and others. They look into Israel, interestingly, as a sign of sort of national spiritual awakening. They look at it and they look at a sort of kibbutz example as a sort of communistic example. But the kind of line that becomes dominant in late 60s and early 70s is very different. So this was to set the scene with sort of Iran, Palestine, Israel. But then what is Shah's actual policy? My argument is that, in fact, Shah's policy on Israel cannot be explained by subservience to the US, because he wasn't subservient to the US always. And it cannot be explained on a sort of a basic core level, but that in fact, it is consistent with what he called national independent policy. Now, independence is always there's a normative value, and we can talk about what you consider independent or not, but I'll try to show how, there are elements that if you want to adopt a framework, this framework of national independent policy seems to explain Shah's policy on this issue. Now, two quick sort of disclaimer about how I'm going to do this. Number one, I'm in the middle of this research, so there's a lot more to learn. I think there's months more of reading, because I started tagging what documents are related to this topic, and I realized almost every single document there is related, because Israel-Palestine comes out in every conversation. And of course, I could go through the wars one by one and sort of look at Iran's policies there, but I think that wouldn't be as interesting. And I haven't done work with all of them. The 1973 war is challenging, for example, because I was not prime minister then. He was ambassador to the US, but we have different sort of file from there. But I'm going to talk about few aspects of how Shah approached the question of Israel-Palestine. And I hope there that I can show that it was consistent with his claim to a nationalism policy, and that perhaps this helps us have a different view of Shah's foreign policy. Now, as a lifelong polemicist, historian, sometimes I try to push in one direction, or sort of I put a question mark, sort of think differently about something. I'm happy to be pushed back on on some of his claims, but I think nevertheless there's something in there. So I would sum up briefly the nationalism policy with you. I would say that Shah was definitely an anti-communist. He was very clear. He hated communism. He thought communism should be fought. He hated the Tudeh party in Iran. He was afraid of the Soviet Union. And globally, he like many other statesmen of the era, he believed that communism was a global threat, right? The specter of communism threatened him. But it's important when we say that to remember what kind of anti-communisms are we talking about? Because there are many different sort of anti-communism. He is a guy who claims he's a socialist. Again, we shouldn't forget. In fact, I have to say, sort of my personal memories. I remember the first time I met the former Queen of Iran, and Pahlavi, and we were talking about sort of Marxism, different ideas of the era, and she said, "Well, Shah was a bigger socialist than all of you, and he was a true socialist." And this I think is important because we will see in the archival record, how does this show itself in the archival record? It shows that Shah, when he follows a policy, he believes that the way to fight communism is development. Now, we can call this Bismarckian. Long ago, Otto Bismarck, Chancellor of Germany, had this idea that the best way to fight the Social Democratic Party in Germany is to adopt policies, basically preempt them, adopt policies that help development. This was, of course, Kennedy's line in the United States in the Cold War. It was a way of fighting the Cold War, but that's, I think, very important. So Shah is anti-communist, but he believes in a state-led development. It's important. He believes in a state-led development, and he believes that a form of what he considers socialism needs to be there to give people what they need so that they wouldn't turn to communism. He was a big proponent of the regional states. The relation between Shah and the United States and some other forces, as we can see, often goes through him supporting the other regional states. The King Hussein of Jordan, as we'll see, is an important part of this, and other states. He's worried about the stabilization of the region. He's worried about the growth of the forces that, after all, he has seen throughout his reign. He comes to power in 1953. He has to live through, just imagine yourself the ride that he has to go through before his overthrow in 1979. The 58 revolution in Iraq, the rise of Ba'athism. You see kings fall around you. It's important. So that's an important element of his approach. The one that might surprise some of you is that he also cares a lot about the Muslim world. He believes in the concept of the Muslim world. His words, not mine, and he believes in it. Now, I think Professor Milani, in his biography of the Shah, also sort of claims that one of the things that really distinguishes Shah from his father is his approach to Islam, of how he prioritizes Islam against communism sometimes, and how sort of he views this question and his personal sort of religious views. But at any rate, Islam is important for him in a flexible manner, of course, and in sort of a civilizational manner. It's not sort of, we all know he wasn't a very great practitioner of Islam necessarily in his daily life, but at any rate, he cares about Islam, he cares about the Shia faith, he cares about supporting religion in some ways. But I think what really interestingly brings a lot of this together is how much he cares about his alliance with Turkey and Pakistan. Again, I'm very grateful for the archives, because there we can see, as there's so much rich material there. I've also looked into other archives, like the National Archives in Britain, about this. But the CENTO, the organization that I mentioned here, CENTO and Regional Cooperation and Development, RCD, this is Iran and its two big Muslim neighbors, Turkey and Pakistan. The other thing, so Shah is a pan-Islamist and a socialist so far, as I can surprises that we have. The other thing is that he's a neutralist. Shah goes out of his way to have relations with the both blocs. He goes out of his way. And a part of this is that, they say there's this theory of under the shadow of Assad, and he has come to power with the support of the US and the UK, and he knows it. And he wants to be independent. He wants to show that he's independent, that he's nobody's sort of, he's his own person. But also, he genuinely believes in this. Whatever shadow you see behind him, he really believes in this. And it's in the practice. Iran, it's sometimes hard to remember, Iran has relations, extensive relations with Soviet Union, with Bulgaria, with Romania, with Czechoslovakia, with Yugoslavia, later on with China, pretty much with the entire world. And we have the record of Iranian talks to the US, and the Americans are not always happy with the kind of relations Iran has, but he does it anyway. In fact, Iran has relations with North Vietnam. Pretty much with any country that it could have. I guess not Albania, because that I haven't actually looked into it, but I mean, I guess Albania was an extreme example. And then he also supports, the other thing Shah is an anti-colonialist Afro-Asianist. He supports non-European states and acting through the UN. And all of this shows itself in Iran's Israel-Arab policy. I should get going further into this, but this really does explain his approach to Palestine and its conflict with the regional countries. He cares about the stability of his neighbors. He tries to solve the conflict through the UN. That fifth point, sorry, I think I was sort of half explained it. He goes out of his way and he says colonialism is over. He's against sort of aggressive actions by the West. He doesn't want them to tell him what to do. He says he believes they shouldn't tell others what to do. And he believes in the UN because his institutions, he believes, are equal weight for the first time. It's interesting that today you can in a lot of leftist parlances, you can hear UN as a den of imperialists and all that. Of course, when you look at it from the other perspective, it was the opposite, because the imperialism had meant that a few European states could run things how they wanted. Now the fact that they had equal representation, even in some ways, no matter how flawed, was usually taken out. So the biggest fan of the UN were the first post-colonial states at the time. And Shah aligns himself with those to a degree, I should say. And that's his approach to Israel. He emphasizes Iran's Muslim nature. He believes Iran should support Palestine very good. He advocates the UN, and he's very worried about the stabilization of other countries based on the conflict. So let's have a few examples, as I said. But I still do like a good story. So let me take you to the morning of June 5th, 1967. This is a few days before Shah is in Czechoslovakia. This was followed his trip to Romania. He then goes to West Germany. He then goes to Paris. In the morning of June 5th, 1967, I like to imagine very early in the morning, Manusher Khosrodad, who is later the head of Iranian Air Force, I believe, and he's the head of Abu. So that's the sort of Marines of the army. Wakes Shah up because the Iranian embassy in Paris is just informed him that the war has broken out. The war that everyone was worried for in the Middle East, and as you can see in the archives, there's a lot of worry for, war has broken out. 2 days later, he's already in Ankara. He goes from Paris to Ankara. Shah gives an interview that you can say it's sort of historic. It's historic because it's repeated throughout, from 67 to the end of Shah in 1979. Every time they talk about, they said, as His Majesty said on June 7, 1967. And what is his position? He strongly condemns the occupation of Palestinian Arab lands by Israel. He says it's a form of aggression. He says it's a form of occupation. He says the age of these things has come to an end. In personal talks later, he uses the strongest possible language. In fact, he says at some point to someone, I think to an American emissary, he says, Israel is now doing to Palestinians, what Hitler did to Jews in the Second World War, which is obviously an exaggeration, but he does use language. And the fascinating thing that I found in the archives is that Iran's private, when it talks to Israelis, when it talks to Palestinians, when it talks to the East Bloc, when it talks to the West Bloc, it says the same thing. It never changes. You see several letters later in 1970s, Zahedi in a televised interview says Shah's position on June 7th, and the war hasn't even finished by June 7th, right? But that's the position. It's the same one at the basic resolution of the UN and the United Nations Security Council. And when Zahedi meets Abu Aban, the Foreign Minister of Israel, which is one of my favorite files in the document, is when Abu Aban and Zahedi and some others meet in a remote in Zahedi's beautiful villas out in Hesarak, and there's a very I'll talk about it later as well. It's a very fun sort of conversation because Zahedi also has this way of funnily discussing some of these issues. But anyways, he says, Shah was the first head of the state to condemn the occupation of territories following the June War. Our position is entirely clear. This might be a mundane issue for you, but it's not a mundane issue if you know something about the history of Israel. And because Israel is used to having people say one thing to them and then something to others, right? There are many who says, well, we know you're right in the war, but we have to sort of say the right thing. But not to Iran's credit, in its approach, it's consistent. So, one of the most fascinating files at the Zahedi archives are these mostly sort of handwritten, but this one is printed, a lot of them are handwritten, of Iran's preparations in the fall of 1967, for the United Nations General Assembly and its meetings with different states. There are different proposals being made. There's the Yugoslav proposal. There's the joint American-Soviet proposal. There's sort of different Arab states have different proposals. Won't get into details here, but what I can tell you is that Iran has a very active role there. And again, it is not, it is certainly not that the US says, hey, you've got to do this, and then they do it. It's anything but. Iran pushes, and Iran pushes consistently for the goals that I mentioned earlier. Iran is worried of what the effect of a resolution would be on King Hussein. Iran is worried of what it would be its effect on the future of the Egyptian state. Iran is worried of what would be its effect on, if Israel gets away with occupying the territory, what would be its effect on the future of international relations? And Americans, a lot of times, are pushing the Shah in a certain way. They ask certain questions in a certain way, and they don't always give the answer. Eugene Roscoe and Arash Zahedi, as you can see here, they had a lot of discussions. For example, Eugene Roscoe, he's sort of the equivalent to a deputy secretary of state at the time for political affairs. I think assistant secretary of state for political affairs. I'm going to play a short video. This is Shah's pilgrimage ziyarat to the site that is site of much fight today, Dome of Rock. Jerusalem, of course, it was controlled by Jews. This is 1959. It was controlled by, before 1967, it was naturally controlled by Israel. I just play this as a sign to say, the Shah and King Hussein have some of the closest relationship in the world. They met each other in bilateral trips between Amman and Tehran, something like 12 times in a period, even more if you count throughout the entirety of their reigns. It was in these steps that King Hussein's grandfather, King Abdullah I, had been killed by a Palestinian assailant. One thing about the kings of the era, they care about the history of kings being killed, regicide. They're worried about it. And this is an event that keeps coming. Let's see. That's the Haram al-Sharif at the time. Before we get to Amrat Khrushchev, I'll stop this here. So the Shah's close support to King Hussein of Jordan is an important element. He's very worried of what will happen to King Hussein as a result of the conflict. He tells Israelis, if King Hussein talks to you, don't make it public, for example. One of the concurrent conflicts. And mostly Shah, let me just clarify here that a lot of times I mean the Iranian, whoever is representative of Iran, because surprise, surprise, by the way, it's about all this sort of internal stuff that we hear about, this guy had that position, that guy had that position. Iran does have a consistent position that is followed by whomever is doing the talking. Zahedi and Shah, very close, they coordinate. I'll tell you of one funny sort of thing that they come to conflict later. But okay, so King Hussein, right? So Shah really cares about the stability of Jordan. He's of course against the occupation in 1967. He's worried about the effect of Israeli discussions with King Hussein becoming public. And he's worried about what happens in the internal affairs of Jordan. Can't give you a lot of details here, but I imagine some would know, right? So when he talks to the PLO later on, he's like, be kind to King Hussein, don't overthrow him throughout the Black September and all that. So this is important. And I say this as a standing because it's not just King Hussein. He cares about the stability of the Arab countries of the region. So he's very understanding when Israelis tell him, well, these Arab countries are against us and all that. Shah or Arash, they respond back that, look, they have their own domestic constituencies and they're worried of what happens if they take a too pro-Israeli position. They'll lose their, how do we go? Okay. Yeah, and you see in RCD, with Turkey and Turkey and Pakistan, he talks about the necessity of strengthening King Hussein. To Abu Aban Ardish Zahedi in December 1970, he says, God forbid, if something happens to Jordan, if the King Hussein is overthrown, what will follow in Lebanon, Kuwait, and Saudi Arabia? Key to Shah's approach is making sure that the radicals in the Arab world don't come into power in more countries. By radical, I mean Ba'athists, sort of Arab nationalists. So what I have there. Palestine as a Muslim issue. This is a message. It's believe it or not, a much shortened, summarized message that reads in much beautiful sort of Persian, very Arabic inflected and very sort of long, to the president of Iraq, President Aref at the time. Now, in Iraq, what Shah was worried for already happened. The key event in his life is the revolution of 1958, when the Hashemite family is overthrown in the revolution by Qasim, and Iraq follows, basically to 2003, from 1958 to 2003, a succession of groups that are all, you can see, either Arab nationalists or Ba'athists come to power. President Aref is one of the Arab nationalists, known to be close to President Nasser at the time, man who had a heavy conflict with Iran, of course, throughout this period. But Shah appeals to him as a fellow Muslim. He goes out of his way to say it's a Muslim issue. This is again not just in this message. Throughout, when representatives of Shah meet with Arab Muslim countries, they say that they care about Islam, that they care about Palestine as a Muslim issue. That's a sort of civilizational issue that they care about because they believe that this is part of his legitimacy. That's sort of approach. And they sort of, it is not just words, right? They give support in different ways. They give support in the UN. They care about this aspect, which also explains why the ties with Israel are secret. This is one of my favorite sort of fun period. So Iran has it's very open secret. Like Iran has extensive ties with Israel. As I said, people come and go. There's energy, there's ties, but despite that, it's officially officially not recognized. There's a famous example that I read in sort of Leo Stenfeld's work. I think there's a Moroccan envoy who is talking to an Iranian diplomat and says, I just saw El Al flight take off from Tehran. And the Iranian diplomat says, no, His Majesty, as His Majesty says, we don't have recognized sites. He says, but I just saw a flight. And he says, well, I believe Your Majesty more than your eyes, right? So, and here there's a very interesting sort of example because Israel basically says, Israel informs the foreign ministry that there's a plane that has to sort of stop in Tehran for an hour. But because there's a diplomat, could you send even a lower level of foreign ministry for protocol so that we recognize there's an Israeli governmental delegation here? And Zahedi says that I accepted, and I also asked Nasiri to send the spy basically to see what's going on in your stuff. But it shows that they're respectful to Israel, right? They do the protocol, but also they're very, when Abu Aban and Zahedi meet in Hesarak, Zahedi says, well, you're welcome here. How do you like Iran? And Abu Aban says, I'm like, this is great. Wouldn't it be great to meet in the actual foreign ministry if you recognize us? And then Zahedi says, well, if you want that, maybe you need to bring the peace. So he said, basically, November 22nd resolution, that's just the resolution 242 of 1967. If you follow the conflict, everyone sort of knows this number. And so Saudi's position is basically what is Saudi Arabia's position today. He says, you want peace and relations with us, make peace with your neighbors in the occupation, and you can have open relations. We have no problem. And he goes out of his way, he says Palestinians have a realist faction. There are those who recognize Israel, there are those who don't, but obviously those who don't are wrong because they're ignoring history. But the position is again very consistent. He also says Arabs would recognize you, but it might take 30 to 40 years. I'll let you do your calculus and with the sort of recent events to see if you have a Nostradamus in late Arash Zahidi, but there definitely seems to be something. The other fascinating meeting that I could see in the archives is Shah's meeting with Tito. Again, if you want to know what importance the archives make. So Shah meets with Marshal Tito of Yugoslavia, right? This important event in the history of the Cold War, in my opinion. This is what we had before these archives, pretty much, right? This is the press reporting at the time. Tito went to Iran, stuff, right? I exaggerate a little bit. There is some more. There's sort of reports given to the other ministers, but now we have everything that was said in the meeting. It's right in that room, 2 minutes walk from here. There's a full report of what Tito and Shah talked about. Marshal Tito, of course, being one of the founders of the non-aligned movement, a leading sort of neutralist proponent. You would think they shouldn't get along so much with Shah, which is supposed to be sort of so pro-West, pro-Cold War, but actually they do, and they have a lot of common approaches, and they talk about the common thing that they talk about. Mind you, this is Marshal Tito, one of the closest people to President Nasser of Egypt. There are many scholars who believe, in fact, that Nasser can be sort of called a Titoist, perhaps, in some of his ideas. So you would think, they should have a very different sort of approach to Shah. But what they agree on at the time, as you can see here, what they sort of complain together about, Tito says, yeah, I also tell the Egyptians, you have to accept Israel, it exists. You can't just pretend it doesn't exist. You can't just want to sort of do it out of ignorance. Shah says, I know, isn't that a drag? They do that. And then, Tito says, when I meet with the Zionists, I sort of, I bash them and say, you're terrible and you're doing these things. But then they found out what I told to the Arabs. So they understand that I actually have sort of a logical view. But the point is, these guys, repeatedly, as we can say, in Shah's meeting with Czechoslovakia, in Shah's meeting with the president of Czechoslovakia, in Shah's meetings with Soviet officials, this is not the meeting of two opposing sides of the Cold War, the way that you would imagine. Here as well, there's a lot of conversations about what can a world of independent countries that are not sort of pushed around by big powers look like. Okay, getting toward the end. Yeah, so let me just say one more thing here before my last slide. This is work that I'm sort of undergoing. I'm interested in it as myself. As my work goes on, and I found much new material in here. I'm not done yet. Then can I stay a few more weeks? I can finish it. But this is Iran's relation with Egypt. It's well known that Iran and Nasser didn't have a good relation. In fact, Egypt early on cuts relations with Iran in the early 1960s. Egypt gives funding to, basically, Egypt tries to fund an armed group against the government of Iran, people like Ibrahim Yazdi, Ali Shayati. They go to Cairo for a sort of short period. The organization of Sama is founded. Nasser starts calling the Persian Gulf the A word, so that, of course, that doesn't make the Shah happy. By the way, this is also, I love that in the documents it shows up. If any person says Gulf, just Gulf alone, from having Gulf at the time, Zahidi or Shah, they don't wait. They don't wait. They cut in the middle of the words and they say something. In fact, they say that George Brown, sort of leading British diplomat, Zahidi says, hey, sorry, I thought you went to school. Aren't you like an educated person? Why do you do things like this? And then George Brown says, look, this is the new British policy. And George Brown basically says, look, my document that I have here says the Persian Gulf. I just wanted to cut one word. Don't say Persian every time. So they're very sensitive about this. Or with Kuwaitis complain and say, look, we use the Persian Gulf, but some people just write Arab Gulf in the post, and the traders, the people, can you not return all their post when they just happen to write everything else? So this is a key issue for Iran. But at any rate, unlike so we all know that Shah and Iran and Egypt resumed diplomatic relations in 1970. President Nasser dies in 1970. We know that they have a very close relation with Sadat later on. This seems to explain itself, right? Relations, Sadat comes, new relations. Not true. Not true. In fact, the resumption of diplomatic relations between Iran and Egypt is a few weeks before the death of Nasser and has a consistent process before. Zahedi cares about this, talks about it in different meetings at different times. Anytime he meets a lot of these Arab representatives, he says, we want better relations with Egypt. We support many of the Egyptian demands. We're not pro-Israel. We're happy to have relations with Egypt. And that's the line that they push. Of course, he also has very tough words for Nasser. In fact, in one meeting, he gets into hot water with Shah, where he says, and excuse my language, but it's in the archives, he says, well, I'll tell you what I think about Nasser. Nasser is a prostitute. He sells himself to different sort of lenders, and Shah really gets angry because this is not diplomatic language. You can't use language like this. But these two things, now, the fun work of the historian is to look at when the changes happen and how does Iran try to explain a different approach. But I'll end with saying, I had a 10-minute version of this talk before, which I ended with this slide, and I want to end it here again after I've done all the work here. I'll end with saying, 2 meetings within 2 weeks of Arash Zahedi, Iran's prime minister at the time, with 2 different figures shows something of Iran's approach. December 14, he met, as I said, referred to a few times in my talk, in Hesarak, he meets with Abu Iran. The position that Iran puts there is clear. He wants the occupation of the territories to end. In no uncertain terms, he condemns them on principle. Says this Iran doesn't believe you can, it's land grabbing, it's wrong. He condemns them in a strategic result. Says it leads to the weakening of different Arab states in the region. He conditions. 41 years before the Saudi Arabia did the Arab Peace Initiative of Land for Peace, he says, you want peace with Israel? We're happy to have peace with you, but you need to end the war. You need to end the occupation. And Abu Iran sort of uses diplomatic niceties and says, oh, with the Persians, you know, we love this country, things are great. Iran has a very consistent position, which says, well, you know, thank you for changing the topic, but you need to end the occupation repeatedly. And when he meets with Khalid al-Hassan, one of the leaders of the PLO, and there are other meetings with the PLO, Iran offers support to the cause. He says, we believe that so far as territories need to be liberated, we believe. So far as the Muslim cause, we believe in it. Iran, of course, offers $500,000. You can see the actual check that Professor Milani had written about before, but I saw the actual check in the archives. Iran gives to Yasser Arafat. You can see Yasser Arafat's huge letter of thank you to His Majesty, the Shah, who thanks him for the support. I looked up another speech of Yasser Arafat within, I think, 72 hours of his notes, where he's speaking to some sort of Iranian groups who were fighting together with Palestinians in sort of Lebanon, and he says the Shah is the head of the imperialist henchman of the region, but he got money from him at the same time, and he, as I said, thanked him in that way. Diplomatic necessities, and sort of put that down. Iran is also clear as to, in Khalid Hassan, it says the same thing. For example, there's a very funny sort of, this is December 1970, right? So September 1970, Black September happened. Jordan instability was a PLO. And then the Khalid Hassan says, oh, we also care about King of Jordan, and you know, we don't want to do anything to stabilize Jordan. And then Zahedi says, well, you know, hijacking 4 planes in 2 weeks and taking them is probably not great for the security of the country. It's also the case that the Palestinian representative brings up possibility of Iran giving armed support. And I kid you not, in the actual diplomatic files, Zahedi says, whenever they said that, I just changed the topic, which is a great, great diplomatic tactic. You just sort of say, oh, isn't it better nice when they sort of talk about that. But I think the 2 meetings together, with everything else that I have babbled about for the last 40, 50 minutes, shows that Iran did have a consistent approach to the Palestinian-Israel conflict and to the Arab-Israel conflict. That the basis of the approach was what Tehran regarded as Iran's national interest. That it was certainly not a one-sided support of Israel. And that, in fact, was predicated of what it believed was a just resolution to the conflict. That it did not give concessions to Israel whenever they asked for it. That it did not give concessions to the US on the request of the US to Israel whenever they asked for it. and that it cared at least as much as it cared for how its relations with the US and Israel was. In the same amount, it cared about its standing as a Muslim country and its standing with its neighbors in the Arab and Muslim world. Adopting that view, we can see that if you study Iranian foreign policy, and if you study Iranian actors based on their own words and their own actions, you're going to have a different view than if you see them as spoken in the words of others. And now that these archives here make this possible, I hope we can have this corrective view. It will, no matter what you think about the Shah, how much you hate or love, as we have heated debates in Iran today, it will give us a better image, a more clear image of how our country's foreign policy was made, and how the Cold War, in which Shah and Iran were important actors, give us also a better image of that global problem. Thank you for your patience.